Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Mandelbaum, and it's an honor for me to host a very special webinar together with Shelley Bodnick of ECHO. We are very proud to introduce you to an all-star group of probably the best doctors treating COVID today in America. The purpose of this webinar is to promote the use of monoclonal antibodies in the treatment of COVID. And it's been a scramble to find vaccines and to find therapies. And one of the therapies that have been highly effective in the United States, but is a bit controversial because of how it came to the market, is monoclonal antibodies. And the purpose and the goal of this webinar is to help and encourage the Canadian Medical Association, the community of medical practitioners and the government to use monoclonal antibodies. In fact, the Canadian government did buy about 26,000 doses. However, it can't be used until the local health authorities and the medical community embraces it. I would like to start the program with Michael to give us a general overview of what it is that we're talking about, how it treats patients, and the effectiveness that you've observed in your own practice at the Mayo Clinic.
Talking about this in the COVID-19 era, and I think the data really is recapitulating what was well known prior to World War II. Most of the studies have been done in high-risk patients. These are people in their 50s or older, typically with the sorts of coexisting diseases that make a COVID-19 riskier and increase their chances of either going to the hospital, and if in the hospital, going into the ICU. And I think the data from the trials typically shows that you can reduce the risk of hospitalization if you give early in these sorts of patients by half or perhaps 2/3, and you can reduce the risk of progression from hospital admission to the ICU as well. So to me, this is a terrific therapy that can help really prevent a lot of bad outcomes in high-risk patients, decompress the hospital system, and especially decompress the ICUs. It'll be terrific if we can help increase the understanding of these parameters and use case scenarios with our friends in Canada so that you can move forward with a monoclonal antibody program.
You say a word about the difference between monoclonal antibodies itself as originally conceived, and we'll call it BAM, as opposed to a cocktail in the Regeneron.
Correct. I think the thing that people are using now is a cocktail of two monoclonals that get two different parts of the virus, which should give you more coverage and should be helpful when you start thinking about some of the variants that have emerged and this sort of thing. But again, I think, Mr. Mandelbaum, I think the key thing here is to get it in the veins of high-risk patients early and limit their odds of getting admitted to the hospital. And if, unfortunately, they do get admitted to the hospital, limiting their chances of progression to the ICU.
Can you tell us what exactly is approved and for who is it approved, Dr. Shom?
There's 3 drugs that have been authorized in the United States. First one is, as you can see on my screen, bamlanivimab. And by the way, everything that I'm going to talk about is publicly available, and you can get it right off the FDA website. We looked at 2 outcomes. One was a viral outcome to see if the amount of virus in the person declined. And that could be interesting, but more important to us and to speaking to the things that Dr. Joyner was speaking about is what happened to them clinically. And it turned out that in the interim analysis, 10% of those that got placebo ended up in the emergency room or hospitalized for something related to COVID. At the end of the trial, that number went down a little bit when they put all the data together, and it was about 6%. And then in the people that got bamlanivimab, depending on what dose they got, it was about 1 to 2% ended up in the hospitals. That's a pretty impressive reduction from 5.8% to 1%. The next drug, and this was actually, I say it's the next drug, it's next on my slide deck, but it happened at the same time, and that's a combination of casirivimab and imdemivimab, and we're just going to call that the Regeneron cocktail. Because that's what that is. The first one is a drug by Lilly, BAM, and the second one is the Regeneron cocktail. That's the one that the former president received. Again, similar story. About 9% got admitted to the hospital or to the emergency room for things related to COVID. 3% in the group that got the treatment. The third emergency use authorization was for a combination that I don't know that we've seen out in clinical use yet, but it's coming, and that's now a combination of BAM plus another drug called etzivimab, and this was the fifth arm, if you will. So the first study I told you about, the BAM study over here, there were 4 arms of different doses or no dose at all, but there was actually a fifth arm as well. And this is from the fifth arm, and that was a combination of BAM plus etzimivab. And placebo group hospitalizations or death were 7%. In the combination group, 2%. And all the deaths occurred in the placebo group. So again, same story again and again and again, is that a significant reduction, and that reduction is not absolute in terms of ending up in the hospital, but it ends up being around 1 to 2 to 3% of people end up in the hospital.
I'd like to sort of at this stage of the program talk about the practical application of it on the ground. And some of our panelists here have a huge amount of experience. Dr. Bander.
Yeah, I think that, one thing to say for sure is that in the academic world of COVID, we've seen a lot of treatments come and go, IL-6 blockers, immune modulators. And when we look even at things like remdesivir and we look at the data, we even talk about things that are considered significant. The benefits are often debated. And I think what got people's attention in the US on the monoclonals was the fact that they had such a marked impact. It wasn't a 1%, 2% decrease in mortality or morbidity. It was a 70% decrease in hospitalizations. So I think that's one of the reasons why when we looked at this data right away and not having anything up, we kind of really jumped into adopting it. So yeah, I think the key point for us to say is if there is no medication that's been proven have any efficacy early on in COVID before you're hospitalized and need oxygen. It's really, all the blood thinners and remdesivir and steroids, those are all medicines for severe COVID. So monoclonals really is our only game in town that we have to decrease efficacy. So there's a couple of different mechanisms. So one is, Mount Sinai has a process that's internal for our hospital and for referring doctors, where people are sent in, they're evaluated by infectious disease, and then they're administered in an infusion chair, the product. But I think one of our bigger successes also is that getting the communities themselves to set up infusion centers. So now, we've set it up with a lot of these, what we call it in the United States, federally qualified health centers, is if you walk in there with COVID symptoms and they do a swab on you, a rapid antigen swab, and it's positive, basically, and you qualify under the EUA criteria, you're diabetic, you're 65, you have one of the, they can actually we put an IV in, we consent you, we give you the therapy over 30 minutes to an hour, you leave an hour later. So the data is the earlier, the better. It's like time from the disease to the antibody infusion makes a big difference. So that's why we believe in capturing patients early.
I think it's important for Canadians to know that it's not that difficult to do. So how does that work on the ground? And I think Dr. Ganesh will share us, how that works in the Mayo Clinic.
First of all, thank you guys for having me. So when we set up our practice, we tried to do it outpatient as much as possible because our main goal was to decompress the emergency room. Our model was a little bit different, where anybody who tested through Mayo Labs that had a Mayo Clinic number, we'd contact them proactively and say, hey, you're positive, you're high risk. When do you consider this infusion? And then they'd come in. I'll echo everything Dr. Bander said about this being a phenomenal product in terms of keeping our high-risk patients out of the hospital. In terms of the actual infusion, I have been on call for over 4,300 infusions across the region. We have seen about a 50% reduction in hospital admission, ICU admission, seen a complete absence of intubation in the people who we've admitted, and we've had nobody who died in the first analysis. So tremendous, tremendous improvements with this monoclonal antibody product.
Cochrane, I understand that you're in charge of administering this type of therapy to some very high-risk patients. What's been your experiences?
Thank you for having me. I'm actually not administering it. I'm screening and referring patients who qualify for it. And so we've set up a way for this to be a nurse-driven initiative at our transplant center. Most of the United States nurse practitioners can practice and prescribe autonomously. And so at our transplant center, if a patient is diagnosed with COVID and have any symptoms at all, they qualify for monoclonals. We've set up a template in the electronic medical record where if you are charting that you spoke to your patient on the phone and they are COVID positive, you are also charting that you referred them for monoclonals. And that referral is to me to screen to see if they qualify. And almost always the answer is yes. The infusion can be administered at one of 7 sites statewide, the largest of which is the convention center downtown.
Do you need a prescription for it, or like you're authorized to do that?
I am authorized to do that on my own.
All right. And Angie, Dr. Medlin, I understand that you've been spending a lot of time with patients on different types of therapies. What's been your experiences, especially in really difficult patient environments?
Sure. I think my setting's a little unique because I know immediately when someone's positive for COVID, whether they're having symptoms or not. And so it was a mixture of, I would screen everyone who's COVID positive and sort them by their risk strata and approach only the high risk patients and say, are you having symptoms or not? If they're having symptoms, offer the treatment. And if not having symptoms, I'd say, hey, if you develop symptoms, let someone know. Which I think actually became kind of a best practice, because then although a patient might be high risk and not having symptoms one day, they can become symptomatic very quickly. So then it puts the nugget in their brain that they can approach someone about the infusion at a later date if they become symptomatic. So, but as far as what you're asking about administering the infusion, I think that I also heard a lot of concerns about, what happens in that hour after. And we also had, I've seen it go very well. Actually, most people feel better pretty noticeably right away.
And I'm sure you're monitoring the patients that you direct to this therapy. What's your experiences on the ground with side effects, with recoveries, hospitalizations?
My clinical experience, I've not seen any severe reactions, and so maybe some people may have some mild effects, but mostly are feeling better, and we noticed an improvement.
What's going on right now in terms of current clinical studies, in terms of interpreting the BLAZE studies, and how could that help us convince the medical community here to engage in this process? Dr. Paneth?
Yeah, look, Mark and audience, there's, as Shmuel laid out, we're talking about the monoclonals made by Lilly and Regeneron that are intended to attack the virus directly. The evidence in favor of it, as has been reviewed, is as strong as anything we do in medicine. There's been a publication of the Lilly product on an inpatient basis. It is not, does not appear to be effective in inpatients. I think the resistance to this form of treatment perhaps comes from, number one, an unfamiliarity with monoclonal antibodies for use in infectious diseases. Historically, they've been used in cancer and autoimmune disorders. Monoclonals are a 45-year-old discovery, won a Nobel Prize in the 1980s far, and it seems to be very successful. I think people are put off by the idea of outpatient intravenous therapy. It seems hard to organize. gotcovid.org, which in the United States, and perhaps somebody in Canada can use this as a model, you can go onto that website and they will get you antibody. They're working with a company that'll actually make home visits and give you antibody in your home. So this is an extraordinary new development organized by Survivor Corps.
What about the complexity of catching just the right patient and just the right moment in the onset of symptoms? Like, does the system catch that?
It depends on how you build it. We built an algorithm into our system to run a report on everyone who was COVID positive. And we used the EUA criteria, greater than 65, BMI over 35, immunocompromised. We used medications and conditions to calculate that. And so every morning we ran a report, and everyone who scored and was COVID positive got called to offer them the antibody.
Very common question. Everybody seems to be asking it. If you did get it, if you did get the cocktail, what does that do with being a candidate for a vaccine?
So it depends on where you are in the vaccine process. So if you've already started getting the vaccine, if you came in, you got dose 1 of a vaccine, and then you got COVID, and then you got treated with a monoclonal, and it's time for your second dose, I think generally what we're doing is we're giving the second dose. If you haven't even started yet, then we're generally holding off on giving you the vaccine. And the rationale is that it's pretty unlikely that you'll get COVID and then get COVID again within the next few months. There is the hypothetical possibility that the monoclonal or convalescent plasma or the combination of one of those plus your own body's immune system to the virus will form a response so that when you get the vaccine, then your body will respond to the vaccine in a way that interferes with the natural response to the vaccine, so you won't get the full benefit. It doesn't play out in all viruses like that. We see this all the time. You get somebody that's bitten by a rabid dog. They get both the rabies immune globulin and the rabies vaccine on the same day, maybe not on the same arm, but on the same day. So I think it's more of a hypothetical, but that's kind of where we are now.
Does it help you prophylactically until some of our politicians get us vaccines?
There are studies on that right now, actually. I think both the Regeneron and Eli Lilly products are being tested in various populations for prevention of acquiring COVID.
As far as I understand, and Shelley, maybe you could help me. Health Canada approved the BAM. It didn't approve yet Regeneron or the cocktail.
That's correct.
Right? So it could very well be that the medical community here, if you could entice them to use it, will only be more comfortable using a cocktail in the BAM. Would you suspect that? Or does it still pay to use the BAM pending approval since they have it already?
So if I can interrupt, if I were Canada, I'd use up all my BAM now while it still works.
Continue to endorse it, and you'll have to work it on the governmental level to get it approved, but it's worth it.
There are tiers, like there's the highest risk patients are going to benefit the most. And so there's something worth being said to go after those patients first, like what we call like the tier 1 patients with age over 65, BMI over 35. Even if we were just to approach those patients with whatever bamlanivimab was available or whatever staffing was available for that, that's a very high risk population that's going to benefit.
You're hearing from Jeffrey and Angie and Ravindra that they're heavy users, intense users. There are lots of parts of the US where it's sitting on the shelf, monoclonals. We hear this all the time. And it's underused, just like in Canada. And for the same complex reasons of resistance, it's a little too difficult. The patient's not that sick. Wait till he gets sicker. All these kinds of not very helpful excuses. So there doesn't seem to be a supply problem for monoclonals in the US.
Is that, for example, like, well, I don't feel that bad, and I'd rather get the vaccine, so I'm just going to ride this out. But if you're high risk, you don't know how quickly you might become sicker. And the vaccine's not going to help in the short term for the COVID that someone already has.
Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And we have high hopes. We would like to take the opportunity to connect you with some of the senior infectious disease doctors if they have any questions. And we are very grateful that there are so many great people, learned people out there who could help us at such a crazy time with the pandemic. So God bless, be safe, and you have our blessings from here in Canada. Thank you so much, everybody.